In June of 1942, U.S. Marines at Midway called the Brewster Buffalo a death trap. Pilots who flew it into combat against Japanese Zeros came home. If they came home at all, swearing they would never climb into one again. But 6,000 miles away in the freezing skies over Karelia, Finnish pilots called the exact same airplane Taivaan Helmi the Sky Pearl. They were not just surviving in it, they were dominating the airspace, racking up a kill ratio of roughly 25-1 against Soviet fighters and bombers. One single airframe, flown by a rotation of different pilots, achieved credit for over 40 kills before the war ended. That record makes it possibly the most successful individual fighter aircraft in the history of aerial combat. How does the exact same design produce two completely contradictory legacies? One Air Force called it a flying coffin. Another called it a weapon nobody could match. The answer is not simply pilot skill, though that did matter. It is hidden in something far less glamorous, the mechanical fine print buried in an export contract signed years before either side ever fired a shot.
You're watching World War II Air Command.
The secret to making the Brewster fighter deadly was removing everything the U.S. Navy spent years forcing Brewster to bolt onto it. When Finland placed its order in late 1939, it was not buying the same airplane the Navy would eventually fly off carriers in the Pacific. It was buying an earlier snapshot of the design before years of Navy-mandated revisions piled on. The early export model, designated the B-239, arrived without the bulky internal fuel tanks the Navy later required, and without the heavier armor and self-sealing protection that would be crammed into the F2A3 variant flown at Midway. That does not mean the Finnish B-239s were flying naked. Photographs of surviving airframes show armor plating installed behind the pilot's seat, and the aircraft did carry self-sealing tanks. But compared to the increasingly overloaded American variant, the Finnish version was a leaner machine, closer to the original prototype than to the aircraft that limped into combat over the Pacific 3 years later. The American F2A3 weight had ballooned. Each modification cycle added steel for armor plating, rubber for self-sealing fuel cells, and entirely new systems demanded by a Navy worried about carrier landings and battle-damage survivability. None of that weight came free. Wing loading on the original F2A1 sat around 24 pounds per square foot. By the time the F2A3 reached Midway, that number had climbed to roughly 34 pounds per square foot, a jump of nearly 40% on an airframe whose engine power barely changed. A fighter is only as good as what is bolted to the front of it, and the same engine that struggled in one climate thrived in another. Both the American and Finnish used variants of the Wright Cyclone radial engine, a rugged 9-cylinder design rated at roughly 950 horsepower. In the humid tropical conditions of the Pacific, that engine had a persistent problem. Marine mechanics at Midway dealt with chronic oil leaks and overheating, made worse by the thick air filtration and aircraft weight the Navy had piled onto the airframe. Pilots already worried about facing the Zero now had to worry about whether their own engine would hold together long enough to get there. Finnish mechanics traced the issue to a flaw in how the piston rings were seated in each cylinder. Instead of treating it as an unsolvable defect, ground crews worked out a fix by inverting one of the rings per cylinder, which dramatically improved reliability. Combined with the colder Scandinavian climate, which is simply easier on an air-cooled engine than tropical humidity, the Cyclone became one of the most dependable parts of the Finnish aircraft rather than one of its biggest liabilities. This is the kind of detail that rarely makes it into the popular telling of the B-239 story. It was not a different engine performing a miracle. It was the same engine, maintained by people who had the time, the climate, and the mechanical patience to actually solve its flaws instead of just enduring them under combat pressure in the middle of the Pacific. The clearest proof of a tactic comes down to a single short engagement that nobody planned to be historic. On July 9, 1941, 12 B-239s under the command of Major Gustav Magnusson were on patrol over Ladenpoja when they ran into a formation of 15 Soviet Polikarpov I-153 Chaika fighters from the 65th Attack Air Regiment. The Chaika was a capable biplane, fast for its type and well armed, and 15 of them against 12 B-239s should have been a contested fight. What followed lasted roughly 10 minutes. By the time it ended, 8 of the 15 Chaikas had been shot down and 4 more were damaged. None of the Finnish B-239s were lost. Magnusson was not just a pilot leading a patrol, he was the architect of the tactical doctrine that made encounters like this repeatable rather than lucky. Finnish squadrons organized themselves into a 4-plane formation called the Parvi, with a pair of aircraft flying low to draw attention, and a second pair positioned above, ready to dive on whatever responded to the bait. It demanded discipline and trust between pilots who had often trained together for years before the war even began, something the rapidly expanding Soviet Air Force with its mix of veteran and barely trained pilots simply could not match in 1941. Among the pilots who built their early reputations during this period was Sergeant Major Lauri Nissinen, who by the end of that year had already claimed enough victories to rank as the squadron's second highest scorer. Engagements like Ladompoja were not outliers. They were the routine product of a system that paired a lightened airframe with pilots who had rehearsed these formations long before the shooting started. The Japanese Zero was built to dominate at altitude, dueling other fighters in thin, fast air. The Winter War and the Continuation War were fought somewhere else entirely, in the mud and snow far below 10,000 feet. At Midway, American Buffalo pilots were forced to climb to intercept incoming Japanese bombers, a slow, grinding process that left them exposed and vulnerable by the time they reached altitude. Zeros, faster and more maneuverable at height, dove on them from above with brutal efficiency. The fight never happened on terms that favored the Buffalo. And over Karelia, the tactical picture flipped completely. Finnish pilots were typically intercepting heavy, unescorted Soviet bombers and slower ground attack aircraft at low altitude. The exact environment where a lighter, nimbler B-239 held every advantage. There was no need to claw for altitude against a faster opponent. The fight came to them, low and relatively predictable. This is where Lieutenant Hans Wind built his reputation. Flying with Fighter Squadron 24, Wind would go on to become the highest-scoring B-239 pilot in history. With 39 confirmed victories in the type, most of them claimed in the airframe-coded BW-393. He scored his first kill, a Polikarpov I-15, in September of 1941, and from there his tally climbed steadily through encounters most pilots would have considered impossible odds. The most striking example came in mid-August of 1942. Wind led a flight of just 6 B-239s against a Soviet formation of roughly 60 aircraft near Kronstadt in what became one of the largest air battles the front had seen up to that point. By the time the engagement ended, the Soviets had lost 13 fighters and 2 bombers. The Finns lost 1 aircraft. Wind himself was credited with 3 kills that day, pushing his personal total past 14. No fighter stays dominant forever, and the B-239's decline tells its own part of this story. By 1943, the Soviet Air Force had started fielding newer designs like the Lavochkin LA-5, which was faster and far better armed than the aging Polikarpov fighters that had filled the skies in 1941. At the same time, spare parts for the B-239s were running short since Brewster's production lines back in the United States had shifted entirely toward other priorities, leaving Finland to keep an aging fleet flying on whatever could be salvaged or improvised. Several of Finland's top pilots, Wind included, transitioned to the German-built Messerschmitt Bf-109 as it became available, recognizing that a newer generation of Soviet fighters had finally closed the gap the B-239 once exploited. The airplane that remained, though, did not simply vanish into irrelevance. A handful of B-239s stayed in frontline service into 1944, and when Finland switched sides that September and turned against its former German allies, at least one B-239 pilot recorded a final kill against a retreating Luftwaffe aircraft during the brief Lapland War that followed. By the time the last B-239s were retired from training duties in the late 1940s, only a handful of the original aircraft remained airworthy at all. The rest lost to combat, accidents, or simple mechanical exhaustion over 5 years of continuous use. The contradiction at the heart of this story is not really a contradiction at all once you separate the variants and the conditions. The Buffalo that died over Midway and the B-239 that thrived over Karelia were related machines built around the same basic airframe, but years and modifications apart. One had been weighed down by a Navy trying to anticipate every possible failure point. The other had been left closer to its original, lighter form and handed to pilots fighting a different kind of war entirely at a different altitude, in a different climate, against an enemy that had not yet learned how to beat it. The export blueprints that seemed like a footnote, a minor difference in equipment lists between an American order and a Finnish one, turned out to be the entire explanation. 2 countries bought variations of the same fighter. Only one of them ended up with a legend.